Hello, listeners, and welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
We are back in Studio Ghibli territory. We are doing a film that, surprise, surprise, I had A, heard of, and B, not seen. So this is the 2013 highest-grossing Japanese film of the year, The Wind Rises. So Miyazaki, then his last film, but he's sort of retired about half a dozen times and then come back. So this for a long time was going to be considered his last film. So it's very much, I guess, Shakespeare's, The Tempest, Prospero. It's that kind of creator. It's about animation, Alex. So we'll kind of go through some of the bits and bobs of the film. I think, it's a Ghibli film, so it looks fantastic. It's beautifully illustrated. Where were you coming from? Had you seen the film before, or is this a new watch for you?
No, I hadn't seen it. I'd heard of it. I'm obviously not the big Ghibli fan that I should be to co-host a podcast on animation.
Me neither.
Yeah. But I was interested to watch it because obviously with thinking about it from the perspective of fantasy, I was like, Is this going to be a fantasy film? Am I going to have much to say today?
Yes.
But actually, obviously, typically, even the kind of design of it lends itself to talk about some of the things we talk about on the podcast. But also, of course, this is a film about dreaming, both overtly and kind of covertly. So, there's
your wheelhouse.
I'm like, oh, great, we've got lots to talk about.
Yes.
So I'm very excited to do so.
Well, it's funny because whenever we do, I think, the big kind of studio films, we struggle a little bit to figure out a good way or a good which way to talk about it, how to do it. And so I think we've put off a lot of films for that reason. So this is one of those moments where we've got a special guest who will allow us to, and they've brought a prop, the art of The Wind Rises. So we are delighted to be joined by Esther Leslie, who is Professor of Political Aesthetics in the School of Creative Arts, Culture and Communication, just down the road, actually, at Birkbeck. Esther, I'm sure, will need no introduction to many seasoned listeners. I think her work has appeared throughout several of our episodes where we've drawn on her research into animation, especially her book Hollywood Flatlands, which I taught 2 weeks ago, in fact. So there we go. Though Esther's interests are largely related to political theories of aesthetics and culture and the poetics of science and technology, of course, including expanded forms of animation. She's published in these areas and many more, with a central focus too on thinkers associated with the Frankfurt School. I will post a full list of publications in the episode blurb because we haven't got much time. But for now, Esther, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for the invite.
So The Wind Rises might perhaps seem, I hope you don't mind me saying, maybe a little left field, given what listeners might know about your work. So I suppose to kick things off, it would be great to hear about where you're kind of coming from, I guess, in terms of the film, and maybe what is this? Are you a Ghibli fan? Or is this one of those ones that really interests you out of all of their films?
Yeah. I think when I was asked what film I would choose, intuitively I sort of went to this, and then when I reflected on it, I thought, actually, this is very strange because in some ways, certain ways, it goes against everything that I think about animation.
Right.
And I was thinking, coming down here, about how, wouldn't it be more logical for me, for, the stuff I'd sort of written, say, about early Disney, anti-realism, the kind of the monstrosity of real gravitational worlds coming into being with Snow White and Seven Dwarfs in 1937, and how that overturns all the anarchic, utopian, liberatory horizons of the early stuff. So wouldn't I really actually be talking about Plain Crazy from 1929 if I really wanted to do animation? Because, that's a bendable, recompositable world, and it exposes all the brutality of capitalist relations, and even has a sort of Tayloristic, Fordistic division of labour scene at the beginning, and so on. So why have I gone for this film? But there's something about it that draws me to it, and the broader context is that I love Studio Ghibli films, and partly I remember going to see Spirited Away when it came here, and that, at the screen on the Green, Islington, that was like an entree, I suppose, into their world, and finding it quite extraordinary, not quite knowing how to position it in a way, being stunned by the imagery, but wondering, is this a children's film? Is it, what am I doing watching this? But then children came along, and one realised there was nothing better than watching Totoro or Ponyo, and just really loving those films and seeing that they bore repeated and repeated watching.
Yeah.
So I guess I'd become inducted into that universe, and I suppose that's what really intrigued me when Hayao Miyazaki announced that this was his last film. The grandeur of that gesture, and so this was going to be summative, and one would have to see it. And then when I heard what it was about, it felt so strange as a topic. I mean, it presented as a kind of biopic, animated biopics. Is that much of a thing? And its embeddedness in history, in this really difficult historical episode, which fascinates me in itself. So in short, and I will say much more, what drew me to it
might
was
insist you do, but
what drew me to it was just the absolute contradictory nature of the film, which is partly also its ambivalence as regards war and political responsibility, and can we have beauty that is not in the end fascist, and how all of that sort of links to Leni Riefenstahl and German cinematic history, and this effort to sort of isolate something that's so beautiful and it has no social consequence. The Olympics, 1936, this is not a political act, this is just the beauty of the human body, and here the beauty of an engineered plane, but it does have consequence, and it is killing, and it kills others, and Miyazaki's sort of dealing and not dealing with all of that simultaneously, and I think that's what intrigues me, because in the end, it's exposed all of that, but it hasn't landed anywhere.
I think that note of ambivalence is a great place to start, because I think one of the kind of key things I'm still wrestling with the movie is this, so there's this kind of controversy around how it handles this kind of its topic of this, it's this, at least on the surface level, celebratory kind of biopic of this weapons designer, this designer of military planes, and I think that's a good way of thinking through the ambivalence we might feel as a viewer, because there's some beautiful things in the film, there's some beautiful things celebrated in the movie, and then there's some horrible things in the movie, and there are some horrible things that you're not sure whether are given their horribleness in the film. So there's the ambivalence we might feel, and then there's the ambivalence that it's probably fair to give to Miyazaki and the kind of the creator themselves, because I think some of that is in the movie, right? How much of it is probably another kind of point of ambivalence we'll have to kind of wrestle with over the next hour. But I'm still wrestling with it, and I have some thoughts on it as we'll go on. But it's that line in the movie, isn't it, about that it seems to pose to the spectator about, by the way, listeners, I can't remember any characters' names, and I'm not even going to try today, so I'm going to speak in abstracts. And Chris, your game is going to be who am I talking about? But there's a scene where two characters are talking, and the protagonist speaks to a kind of elder mentor figure, and he says, would you still like pyramids to be in the world, right? And that's the kind of question, right? Would you rather live in a world with the pyramids or the world without them? And his kind of answer is, I would rather live in a world with pyramids. I think that might be Miyazaki's answer as well. I'm not sure if that's my answer, but I'm not sure is probably my thing. So it's a difficult kind of thing to wrestle with on that level.
Yeah, and that was, it intrigues me, because I wonder about that line. Some people I know think it's sort of straightforward, but I don't know, maybe because I'm suffused with Ernst Bloch's idea that the pyramid is the death architecture, and so, and possibly, maybe we don't know, I'm not sure, is it built, maybe built by wage labour, maybe built by enslaved labour, I'm not sure, but, it's a magnificent feat of architecture, but to what end?
Yeah.
Is it a monument to death? Is the Mitsubishi Zero in the end a monument to death? And if it is, then would the world have been better without it? Or is it doing that thing, like that line that Orson Welles has in The Third Man, about, or rather Harry Lime has in The Third Man, about 500 years of corruption, intrigue, warring. We have the Renaissance, 500 years of peace, and we get the Swiss cuckoo clock. And we're all supposed to understand that, of course, we would want the Borgias and the Renaissance and not the Swiss cuckoo clock.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure, because in some ways, Miyazaki's world and his mountains and Davos and all of that are a kind of Swiss cuckoo clock.
Yeah.
And maybe, maybe that prettiness, maybe a sort of modesty is preferable, but certainly within the film, the answer is, we can't. We have to go for these things because they are grand scale and they are about striving and they are about magnificent change in the world. And otherwise, we would just have nothing. And anyway, I mean, isn't the underlying ambivalence, which is in the title, The Wind Rises, that the underlying ambivalence is we're blown around. In the end, there's only death. It might be the death that comes from an earthquake that erupts out of nowhere. It might be the death that comes from humans fighting in wars. Either way, we're all going to die. And it's just, have we tried to produce something beautiful or meaningful along the way?
Yeah, and I think there's perhaps something political in that Miyazaki seems to be trying to get at, and this is where I thought this is what kind of my main contribution about the kind of how the film works as a piece of fantasy, is that it actually reminded me quite a lot of Pan's Labyrinth, which is a movie we've done on the podcast before. But the central kind of gag, he uses quotation marks because there aren't that many gags in Pan's Labyrinth, but the central gag of Pan's Labyrinth, for those who kind of are thinking of it as a work of fantasy, is that there's these two registers of Pan's Labyrinth of the wartime setting and the kind of the dreamlike setting, and those two registers happen here. In Pan's Labyrinth it's a bit more literal, but here we have literal dreams of flying and characters who aren't real speaking to the main protagonist and the kind of, all that kind of stuff, and then we all have the wartime setting. But the gag of Pan's Labyrinth is that actually the fairy tale structures are all in the real world, and it's in the fantasy where things get more complicated. So if you think about that movie, the big bad wolf exists in that movie. It's just a fascist captain playing him. And there are all these kind of archetypal characters, but none of them are in the fantasy world. They're all in the real world. So actually it's the real world that is a fantasy. It's a fascist fantasy that the film's fantasy rhetoric is trying to subvert and push against. And I don't know how much I want to apply that to this because I'm still sitting in that ambivalence. But that is sort of where I was like, there's a certain politics of there's the politics of the character here choosing to make something beautiful, even if it creates death, causes death, fueled by death. But there's also the decision of Miyazaki to try to make a film that's deliberately kind of got its head in the clouds about something that feels so of this earth, almost turning away from the kind of spectre of the death up into the clouds as being some sort of political act.
Yeah, that actually what leads it all, or what is predominant, is that the green rolling hills where the fantasy takes place.
Yes.
And always, the next achievement, the next dream. On the ground, they always crash, don't they? And even when they work and are the most marvellous achievement, zero came back, nothing. So, the real world where the achievement crashes, in a sense, is less sustaining or less motivating than this other place, which would kind of try to be contradiction-free, or where things can be resolved, or where nothing has to end. So his lost, dead love, can return, blown back in, and it is that thing, isn't it, of she's always appearing on a gust of wind, or her hat is blown, the clouds are blown, and there's a kind of blue sky area where what really matters, I suppose, takes place.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's fantasy is no different in terms of its storytelling strategies than realistic fiction. Its only key difference, and it's an important one, is it doesn't pretend to be fiction, or it doesn't pretend not to be fiction. Realist fiction is always keen to try and mask its murky rhetorics, and fantasy wants you to see him. It goes, yeah, look at me, I'm a fantasy. Like, you're buying into this. It's up to you, really. You don't have to buy into it. Like, I'm not real. And there's something at work there, I think, that I'm up for, but I'm also a little bit not so sure about. Chris?
No, I'm not so. I mean, I really liked the film, but I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure how best to put it into words, because I'm sort of building from the ground up in some senses, because a lot of obviously Studio Ghibli's work, and particularly Miyazaki, is often, there is that essay on the tension between nature and modernity and all that. There is that. Then you have films like the Grave of the Fireflies, where you're trying to kind of navigate the explicit. There's something very matter of fact about the film, and so it felt very on the nose and very. And I think it comes to the character Kiro, who is like his best mate. It's very it's very direct. There's lots of mentions of engineers turn dreams into reality. Why is everything? I think there's one. Why is everything basically so old-fashioned? Why? And there's a really great line. Even the new buildings are old-fashioned. So there's something quite. It's not Grave of the Fireflies. It's not using fantasy in the same way. It's not using the fantasy of Totoro. It's not using the fantasy of Spirited Away. No. In many ways, the fantasy is not. It doesn't, to me, is not necessarily where the politics lies. The fantasy is just kind of treated and kind of flattened within the film, and then the rest of the film is kind of navigating through these real historical moments. The fantasy doesn't hold the same role in this film than. In
what sense? And what do you mean by flattened?
Well, because I think I think this comes from the design, like animation, in terms of there not being how can I put this? That there's not such an overt signifier that there is a shift undertaking between the reality of the film and the fantasy of the film. So I wrote my first note was like, oh, okay, so there's an immediate scene of flight. That's like classic Ghibli. That's very like, we can start doing some analysis of that. And then it's sort of almost disregarded as a dream. But then constantly the film flicks between and doesn't seem to make any designation over what is real in the film and what is fantasy. And it doesn't matter. And the kind of fluency, the flattening of those two registers, I found quite striking, because we've done a previous podcast on multiplanarity and the idea of looking out of a train window and the foreground seeming to move a lot quicker than the background, and thinking about, or using Tom Lamar's work to think about animation aesthetics. There are scenes like that in the film, where you look out of a window and you see these amazing kind of uses of background. But I felt that was how the film kind of treated time and fantasy generally. There was a real fluency and a flattening out of how we're supposed to understand the real world and the fantasy, and it doesn't matter that. It doesn't matter in that sense. That's what I mean, that there's a fluency between them, and the film doesn't distinguish. And so because maybe it's because it's all animation. There's not that sort of shift to another way. It's just all part of the same fantasy.
But is it because, in a sense, it's his dreams depicted? So it's like, obviously it's not magic fantasy or the impossible, in some way. It's just, well, what would happen if we could open up his head and record his real dreams that are happening? So
he's animated, so his fantasies will be animated as well. Yes, I see.
So it is all the same kind of.
I think it's a bit of that, and this is kind of what I think it's also. I think there's a reading of the film which is that's kind of this mode of doing fantasy. Mm-hmm. A liminal fantasy, for those checking off their rhetorics of fantasy, playing the rhetorics of fantasy drinking game at home. The liminal fantasy of kind of this a deliberately declaratory kind of fantasy setting.
Yeah.
This is a dream. It is not real. This other stuff in the fiction is real, but this is not real. That kind of liminal process. But then merging it together, just as you're saying, I think encourages the viewer to go, oh, actually, okay, to a certain extent, well, none of this is real. Like, it is historical, but it isn't real in the sense that it is just as much a fantasy. All of reality is just as much a fantasy as fantasy. The only difference is that fantasy tells you it is. You know, so a fascist is living in a fantasy world, and they're desperate to make their fantasy world come true. What the film's politics might be is making sure we recognise it as a fantasy, because then we have an element of choice about it. There's this kind of faux objectivism of this is the way the world is, rather than the way I'm choosing for it to be, gets removed, and you can make a decision not to have that worldview. You can make a decision to live in the clouds instead. And I think there's some quiet politics going on there.
Which is why I think the scene at the sanatorium fascinates me, because that's ostensibly in the real world.
Sure.
I think he's sent there to recover after this extensive work, and he runs into the love of his life there, and there's the German, you know, Hans Castorp, who is sort of, you know, in a sense, especially in the English version with his Werner Herzog tones, articulating, you know, what's really happening in the world and what's coming, and there's a sense of, you know, concretion about, you know, the historical horrors to come, although, you know, this doesn't affect our hero, and he's not going to stop making the plane. There's not going to be any revelation there. Ironically, because, you know, this is based on Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain book, and it was during the writing of that Mann had a political epiphany, and, you know, went against sort of imperialism and war and for democratic expansion, very pro post-war Weimar Republic and so on. But somehow for us this scene which moves the love story along is in the real world, but to me it feels like a pure fantasy space. Yes. And it's up in the mountains, so it's close to the sky again. It's not in what Thomas Mann's book calls the flatlands, which I find funny. You know, the real world sort of down there, which are the flatlands. This is up in the sky. So it's that proximity. It's real, but it's fantastical somehow, or we're in the realm of delusion and illusion that we need to sustain ourselves. And maybe that's also sort of echoed as well when they're back in the city. She's left the sanatorium, she's staying with him, and he finally draws the Mitsubishi Zero, the well-engineered fighter plane, while holding her hand as she's dying. And it's real, but that's also sheer fantasy, or it's in another space. I don't quite know how to...
So this is this thing about liminal. So this would be a liminal fantasy.
I am calling this a liminal fantasy.
So do you think when liminal fantasies are animated, they have to work harder, or they have to work in a different way because of that? Well, it's all animated, so of course his dreams will be animated, and and there's a line early on where he's also very aware that he's dreaming, and he sort of says, "Yeah, I'm in a daydream. Like this is what I'm doing now. This is how it's working." And so it's assigned to the audience, but it's also he does this all of the time. So, but I just wonder whether liminal fantasies, whether if a liminal fantasy is animated, that you don't get that shift from, you know, even in Harry Potter, where you have moments and then Dumbledore takes him to Harry Potter to like platform 9 3/4, and it's this dream, and it looks totally different. So I'm just wondering that kind of the way that liminal fantasies work, they have to work slightly differently in animation to almost overcome the flattening, or the fact that this is all the same medium, or maybe not, maybe it doesn't.
Or they work even better.
Yes, that's also true.
He says, vomiting at his own academic insidiousness. But yes, no. So a liminal fantasy is about this kind of getting the reader, or the viewer in this case, very slowly to see the fantasy in the construction, the basic construction of the text. WandaVision, the first couple of episodes of WandaVision might be a nice example of liminalness.
Yes.
So in a way, animation's really good at that, because making a realistic, he uses quotation marks, story through cell animation almost is quite liminal anyway, isn't it?
This is what I mean.
It's your thing about it's never just a shoe. It's a comment on a shoe.
Yes, animation is always, as animation studies loves to bang on about the whole. Animation is rhetorical. It's enunciative. It's inherently metaphorical because it's not the thing. It's the comment on the thing. So I guess we've never thought about this in terms of the categorization, but whether a fantasy, and maybe that's what I mean about the film flattening. The film acknowledges the fact it's a dream, just disregards it. It's as much about flying as it is falling, and then we just get out, and the character doesn't have, as you say, mentioned like epiphany. He doesn't have okay, we're gonna. There's a really interesting just seriousness of treatment of fantasy as just something that one does all the time, and it doesn't matter. And that's part of how it matters.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter in the film.
It matters not because it's exceptional, because it's everyday. It's something that's part of all of our worlds, and
Yeah. And so I'm trying to get my head around how that register works in relation to Spirited Away, which is doing fantasy in a slightly different way, and Totoro. And that's why I'm sort of, again, ambivalent about... Well, not ambivalent about the film. I love the film. But trying to think through... How whether it's obvious, I don't know. I find it quite intriguing.
Is this a very different Miyazaki movie?
This is a very different Miyazaki.
Is this a very? That's the question, I guess.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yeah. And
No, sorry, Stan. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say I think it. I think it is. I mean, part of the argument when it came out at the time, there were people who were really angry with it, weren't they? Because they didn't understand how a figure who was avowedly a pacifist, anti-nationalist, could make such an ambivalent film and also deny the real conditions of production, the enslaved labour that had to make those planes, Koreans, I believe. And so, it's very real-world landing is really contested and just feels unlike anything one would expect, and maybe that's what impelled him, although who knows, to make another film, and The Boy and the Heron being so different as regards fantasy and what it's saying about the creative impulse, and sort of detaching it it's still really, really complicated and enigmatic film, but not welding it to destruction in the same way. So that was just an answer to this. This is sort of different.
No, it's very different. I think it's the register of the reason is the register of fantasy, because it's very. I don't know how to put this without basically saying there's no people who look like pigs scoffing their face of food. So there's just a different type of fantasy, and I don't know what that is in the context of a Ghibli film. It's a different, because in many ways it's very true. It looks amazing. It's a wonderful film.
But there's the fantasy of there's the red herring of these dream sequences, right? Which is like where you might go, where
that's where
listeners
most
might
fantasy.
think I'm going to just talk about the dream sequences and then I'll shut up and let you guys talk about animation. But I guess that's a red herring in that, yes, though what they do is enunciate a kind of they kind of are a kind of like a foghorn of there's fantasy everywhere.
Yes,
and it's more in the bits like the earthquake basically sounds like a kind of demon, doesn't it? Like it sounds like one of Miyazaki's kind of monsters from Spirited Away or something like that. Like it sounds like a personified kind of demon from the deep. It kind of even sounds like Totoro. Like I was like, is that just a Totoro noise? That those kind of little details that are there throughout. Your example, the sanatorium scene, Esther, is exactly the kind of thing I was thinking of. There's all these little like the design. There's like all of these worlds are fantastical.
But I think the issue with the film is that the reason that we're ambivalent about the way it's working is because the characters are not ambivalent. The characters are seem very. This is a dream. And often in Ghibli films you get you get hesitating characters. You get Chihiro from Spirited Away, not quite sure what's going on. But I feel like everything is shown to us in the film. Everything is very planned and so the characters are aware of the different registers, and they're very, and it comes from maybe these are engineers, so it's all very, it all locks together. And so because the characters don't hesitate, it's a spectator's like, well, hang on. Now, I was expecting the film to be so certain. I think that's what I mean by matter-of-factness. It seems very certain in the message that it's articulating.
Hi everyone, it's Alex here, just interrupting the podcast for a moment. Apologies, we'll get back to the scintillating conversation in just a second. I'm interrupting it with just a little bit of admin and a little bit of a plea to listeners, because we need your help, frankly. We have been running the podcast now for quite a few years. We're very happy running the podcast. We are thrilled by the amount of listeners we get. Always have been, always will be, and it's always growing, and it's always a really wonderful community out there. So thank you so much for listening. But the podcast doesn't do itself on its own. It requires Chris and I's time, and it also requires a bit of cash injected into it. I'm not asking for donations in this little plug here, but I am asking for your help to make sure we keep the podcast going on a financially sustainable and sort of time sustainable place. For example, right, there are hosting fees to pay. Okay, that's a couple of £100 each year. There's things like tech and cables. You might have heard a few episodes where Chris and I sound a bit echoey. That's because one of our cables broke and we had to find a way of replacing it and paying for it. And frankly, one of the things we're trying not to do is use our own money or our own pocket, our own wages, frankly, as full-time academics to pay for this stuff. We'd rather try and find alternative ways of funding it. Now, we have done that in the past and we'll continue to do that. We have no plans to introduce membership fees. We have no plans to start trying to sell you guys merch or asking you to go onto Patreon pages or anything like that. We want to keep this a free, easily accessible, educational resource which we're proud to produce, and we're really pleased that we are producing. So all we need from you is just a little bit of more help in terms of helping us to showcase the value of this podcast to some of the people that might pay for it. Okay, so the way you can do this is like a couple of different ways. One, subscribe. Okay, if you're not already subscribed to the podcast on whatever platform you're downloading this from, please subscribe now. Those figures really help us. Second, review the podcast on any kind of platform, okay? A star review is helpful. Written reviews are even better, okay? If you haven't done one of them and you listen to our show and you think it's valuable, please take 3 seconds out of your day, just write a couple of sentences about what the podcast does for you, why you like it, and share that on the platform. That really, really helps. Third, share it with your friends. Share it on social media when you see a new episode being launched, okay? It helps increase the visibility. Hopefully more people can get it and access it too. That's really, really helpful. Finally, and this is a good one, this would actually be really, really helpful, is email us if you use the podcast in any kind of setting, okay? Whether you're an individual that just finds it useful, tell us why it's useful, particularly on an educational level. What have you learned from the podcast? What do you find that's valuable? What value has it brought to your life? Or what impact has it made on your life? I know that kind of sounds very lofty, but if you can just put the kind of simple, real-world changes that you've made, some things that how has it helped you approach the study of fantasy animation differently, anything like that, you can email us. That would let us know. If you're an educator and you use this podcast either to teach students or as part of your own research or as a way of inspiring further thought, let us know exactly how, some of the specifics. Maybe there's a course you have it subscribed to. Let us know. We know of some of you out there. We've worked with you in the past, but if you whether we've worked with you or not, please drop us that email. Really, really helpful. And you can do that at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Basically, we can fund this podcast through various ways through our own network, but what we need from you is evidence that the podcast is doing something out there in the world. It could be doing something small and sort of not very tangible, like helping you to enjoy fantasy and animation movies. Great, tell us how. That's really, really useful, but we need the evidence for it. Or it could be, helping teachers, helping practitioners. Are you a company out there that set it on your training session? Anything like that. We know of you people out there. We find you in various different ways, but it'd be really helpful if you could come to us so that we can gather that data as we approach another round of kind of scrape together some cash to keep the lights on. Okay, it's not much. Yeah, it only costs us 400 or 500 quid a year to keep this thing going. We think we give a lot of time to the podcast. Hopefully you'll think that's a reasonable exchange. We give that time often outside our full-time jobs. We're just looking to kind of find ways of boosting our case to get the funding out there elsewhere. So no Patreons, no merch, I'm afraid. But if you could help us in those ways, share, subscribe, review, or email us with your stories, that would be very helpful. The email address again is fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Let's get back to the show.
So would it be right though to call fantasy something else then? Is there room in the definition of fantasy here for fantasy to be the motivating illusions or things that we carry in our head that, you know, that make our hero get up, you know?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly the kind of fantasy it's interested in, right? So it's what it's saying is that all these characters have fantasies. And it is inherent of being in the world is to be in a world of fantasies, because it is the basic psychological condition of a human to postulate, to imagine, to be one step separated from the empirical world we're in. So if we embrace that, and this is where things can get a little bit, you know, choose your dream. You know, if there is a certain, you know, accepting that requires us therefore to at least make an active choice as to which fantasy world we want to live in. And some of the characters in this film are choosing to live in one fantasy world, and there is an option not to live in that world. And I think in a way, the kindest reading I could offer for this movie is its politics is going, well, I'm going to choose not to live in that world. You know, I'm not going to be Steven Spielberg filming the death and destruction of D-Day as realistically, quotation marks, as I can, because that is a fantasy of war. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be Terrence Malick, and I'm going to turn the camera around and show you some beautiful nature instead. Because at least rather than live in that fantasy, I'm going to live in this one instead, and I'm going to show beauty and organic structures in the world.
And we're not going to show the result of all this warfare, which is, you know, which many animes have shown of Hiroshima, Nagasaki bombs and so on. We're going to stop it kind of before then. Yeah,
I'm not going to draw it. Like, if we add the animation, I'm not going to spend this studio's time drawing these images. I'm going to draw different images.
And that I mean, that's one of the things that draws me to it as well, though, is just the that observational quality. You know, the drawing of the drawing of grain on wood and, you know, particular metals, and how, you know, you're in Japan, the whole palette of colours of this Japan where they still use oxen to pull the plane out to the testing field, and, you know, that's that colour, and then gloomy Northern European Germany, and what that is, all of that sort of being observed so closely, and with a kind of And there's one point always where it makes me laugh when they get so excited about the idea they're shaving, you know, a few pounds off the weight of the aircraft with these sort of planed down rivets or whatever, and it's like so nerdy kind of engineering thing, and you know, as you indicated before, Christopher, you know, so many of Miyazaki's films are about flight. There's always flight, and you know, and so we could. I think I read somewhere that the manga version of this did have pig's heads, like in Porco Rosso.
Really?
So there was a transposition of it into this more apparently human or childlike set of characters.
Yeah, no, that's got my favourite bit. We could leave out the guns, and then everyone starts laughing when they're trying to shave off the weight and stuff. So I love this sort of fatalism. So I wrote down fatalism. Maybe I've not got this right, but fatalism kind of allows the film to be secure in showing the fantasy that we carry in our head and when and how we fantasize. So the fatalism sort of frees up the film to not have to. Yeah, it's secure and it's. I think that's what I'm getting at. There's characters just saying things. It's not flight because of. This is not Kiki's Delivery Service. This is not Howl's Movie Castle. This is the articulate. This is how things fly. actually on the ground, the kind of realism of that, the nuts and the bolts of it, and the putting. So there's something quite diagrammatic, I think, about how the film shows these things. Like it almost it basically shows you how fantasies are engineered. Engineers turn dreams into reality. Like there's a kind of their idea of engineering, and I wonder whether that's. I don't want to be too reflexive on. Okay, so this is about Miyazaki and his last. But he's basically going. This is how I construct these things. I do this and I do this. So I sort of don't. Everything's by design, and I don't quite know what to make of the film. But I kind of like this idea of fatalism being this freeing up of allowing Miyazaki to go like, this is how we fantasize, and this is when it's appropriate, and this is when we do it, and it's just how things are.
I wonder about that production line. I remember seeing a documentary about Miyazaki talking about, I think it was during the making of Ponyo and the storyboarding, and him saying, well, we don't really know where the story's going to go, and it can take different directions. But of course with this film, its episodic nature, and it's sort of clamped between, whatever it is, 1912 and 1937. Yeah. It's like, it's hung on this scaffold without deviation, and, at some level there's a historical reality and a biography that's being mediated, and that sort of locks it in a way that Ponyo or other films were not, and were able to roam and take different paths. So I was quite struck by that idea though of saying this is by design and this is engineered and it almost like modular in the sense of its sort of biographical staging and so on, that perhaps produces a really different atmosphere and different relationship to freedom and to self-reflexivity. I'm always wanting to think, the thing I love about animation is that all animation is about animation, and there's that meta aspect of it, and it's always sort of self-theorizing in some regard. But here I'd struggled to find that kind of self-theorizing in that regard. But maybe there are other ones that it is about how you put something together. But and watching it, I often wonder, well, could this have been a live action film? How would it be different? And
to me, it feels like a film from a filmmaker who's kind of in last hurrah mode, having done their theorizing on animation, and now are using that theorization to kind of say, because I don't think it would work as I think a different version of it would work as a realist movie, but I think its confidence comes in that, like, okay, there is no indexicality here, there is no the world as it is, so it's all about these animation's representational or non-representational power directed at this modular, biographical, realistic story that felt like that to me. Except, of course, when we get to kind of these dazzling displays of flight. So yeah, what is the deal with flight in Ghibli? That's the impossible question of the week.
I mean, I don't have much to add other than I think
there's just lots of it.
There's lots of it
in different ways, be it broomsticks, be it hot air balloons, be it fighter planes or other types of plane.
I think it's often connected to the age, in my sense, the age of the kind of shoujo female character, this kind of in between child and adulthood. This Kiki's Delivery Service is a good example, where a character's kind of ascending to adulthood. So it's using flight kind of that way. There's lots of stuff written on anime and flight. And Susan Napier talks about flying as a metaphor for female independence in Japanese popular culture, but I don't know kind of too much about that. I think there is something in the film about the way that flight gives you a sense of fantasy in the real, because it's this kind of disembodied, slightly unusual way of seeing the world, so that it kind of it lends a sense of fantasy to the real. And I was struck by what you said about this kind of scaffolding to this realist, these moments, these real life moments. And I was wondering whether or not the film was kind of commenting on the fact that fantasy the real world will keep pulling you. It will keep grounding you because the film can't help but keep going back to these real life. Oh no, we're pulling you back. So fantasy can't take you too far away from the real. So I don't know too much about the flying, but I think it's very gendered and it's very kind of connected. I think to the generational quality of a lot of anime protagonists more broadly. With Ghibli, there's a lot of specific. Castle in the Sky, Howl's Moving Castle. We've done a lot of the films where flying and sort of aviation is this particular theme. Here it's confronted head on, immediately made a fantasy, and then becomes part of the plot of what the character wants to do to conquer the sky.
Although the tragedy of him, in a sense, though, is his short-sightedness means he can never fly. So what is better, to be the person who designs the experience for others, or to be the one in the cockpit and all that would open up in terms of vistas? So there is some... It's different in the sense that it is denied to him, I guess. And even when they try to be passengers, they're at the Junkers plant in Germany and looking at this new extraordinary warplane that's been developed. Engineering, and then they're sort of kicked out because some higher ups want to come and sit there, and so they can't even really occupy the things that they're making. And so there's also something. Maybe there's something about labour relation. I don't know. Something about who makes and who carries it out and who gets to benefit, and these different sort of parts that people play in relation to that. But I suppose I just wonder, is it a tragedy for Jiro that he can't fly these planes, or is it and does that somehow cast it so he'll always remain with a fantasy of flight, even as he makes flight possible?
Well, I don't know, I'm thinking probably now far too literally, having just gone off on a fantasy tangent. But he can fly, he just can't fly the plane, right?
Yeah.
And the only reason I raised that question of agency is that the one thing I noted, and I hadn't really I had written it down, but I hadn't really thought to say it until you just made that point about gender.
Yeah.
It's quite it's unless I've missed a beat here, it's a very masculine
whole character or something.
Space flight in this movie, right? And it's interesting that you say, and actually other Ghibli movies it's often feminized, isn't it? I don't know.
It's a whole masculine world. I mean, the women, and there was criticism, wasn't there, the way women are depicted.
Right,
maybe,
fine.
That's a realism of 1912 Japan or something.
Yeah.
But I remember reading in the book The Art of the Wind Rises that they were having to draw kimonos, and none of them really knew how to draw or animate a kimono, and having to have a sort of, fashion historian come in and show them and just sort of, the women seem to be within an older world or a more traditional world, and the spirit of the home, and much as the mother of our hero is very she's loving and forgiving, and when he comes in as a little boy beaten up, you're quite the little hero, aren't you? It's all very giving, and all the women are very giving within it, but they're not part of this masculine world of flight where the clothes are changing, they're westernizing in some way, or producing other kind of relationships to the world.
I'd not thought about that split actually. That the world of Jiro, Kiro, and that sort of the world of aviation versus the world inhabited by Nahoko, who is his sort of love interest, who he meets when she's I can't remember exactly how old she is, but then they meet again when they're older. So but I've not really thought about there are certain scenes that are very modern, and then there are very scenes that are very there is a stark juxtaposition between these sort of painterly backgrounds that are a lot more impressionistic than other. Maybe I just watched it and I thought, well, these are very lush backgrounds. These are very, in a way that I hadn't seen before. Like I felt like that there was a real kind of sense of artistry. But And also, even my favourite bit is the earthquake bit, because it seems like the cells are moving rather than the drawings are. The animation is being moved. It feels like it's a real throwback to the kind of 60s anime where the backgrounds are just literally being moved. So it felt like the earthquake is just moving up the cells. And then, anyway, so I really like that. But I wonder, there's certain this tension between even the new buildings are old-fashioned. I'd not really thought about that as a split of kind of gender, because the women in the film are dressed quote unquote traditionally. There's also close-ups of different types of shoes as well. Versus this hyper modern. So I'd not really thought about it being a split of gender, actually.
Although the sister is training to become a doctor, so I suppose that's a kind of harbinger of another possibility, I guess. Although within the context of the film, she fails. She fails to really communicate how serious things are, or to save, to heal. But that it's impossible to heal Naoko. But she's.
Is that fatalism again? Because it feels like Miyazaki's like, I mean, this is where it's all headed. This is modernity. Like, I spent a long time trying to talk about nature, and I don't know, that maybe it feels quite fatalistic in that sense. That Miyazaki's like, well, this is sort of how battles are fought now. This is how the way that the world's going. Like, there's a sort of inevitability to. So I don't know. Maybe
I don't know. I was struck that again, this ambivalence. It's a very masculine space. Yep. There are lines in the movie. I don't have any of them written down, but there are lines in the movie where, like, is it his sister or his love interest is like, oh, you get to go and be a pilot and I can't, or something like that. There's leads that voice that kind of, this is not a space that women are allowed in. Then there's the kind of, dream sequences where he is flying. We have this kind of, when the film starts with this kind of dream of flight, and then we see the reality dream, quotation marks, but the dream of flight and then the reality of flight. We see a lot of these dreams of flight. They're almost always just men in it.
His hero is
the kind of, again, part of this reflects that this is a space that only men are allowed to occupy in 1910, 1920s, 1930s, Japan and Germany. Mm-hmm. But it's odd that there's no even fantasies of female flight, when this is all linked to kind of dreaming and ambition and individuality and agency and all this kind of stuff. It's not there, is it?
No, or it's, they are blown in with their umbrellas. It's a sort of muse-like, or they are of the clouds. They are ethereal. They are already flight, because it's what man pursues. So they don't need these clunky metal lumps, that you've got to difficultly get to roar through the sky.
Yeah, okay.
I was thinking about that. Yeah, but I was also thinking about all these sorts of these moments where the wind, the eponymous wind of the film's title, is part of how the film creates its its meetings and things, and it's often. I've not thought about this, but it's often kind of, I don't know how to, but it seems like there's lots of scenes of women not being able to that they keep getting sort of, I don't know how I'm going to say this, but like we have the young girl who almost, it's at the start where she almost falls off of the train, and Jiro catches her. That's at the start, and Kino's leg is broken. Then there is when they meet again as older, it's the umbrella, isn't it, that flies. So there's a women's relationship to nature versus like this kind of the conquering of the space and the aviation, and then I don't want to say the female character's inability to, but there's the wind is something that is women are subjected to, and that they are unable to. It often causes the conditions by which they need to be either saved or recognised, or I don't know. There's something about women's relationship to nature. Oh, you spoilt the wind has spoilt your painting, and she's like, well, it'll be a memory of that day. And so I'm trying to get my head around the women in the film and the female character's relationship to the wind of the film's title, and figuring out how the male characters work within a space that they have conquered the elements, because they are working. Do you see what I mean? I'm sort of haphazardly saying it.
No, I think so, but I guess the question I was going to pose relates to that. Is like, so is this are we saying this is an omission on Miyazaki's part, or is this another example of this kind of like ambivalence of like, is this a point he's making, which is that, you know, to kind of use equally kind of simplistic but kind of garbled language, the men spend all their time trying to conquer the space because they're men,
and women just say,
it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's a kind of feminine gesture of like not needing to do that act of conquering.
Yeah.
And is the film kind of going, that's masculinity and femininity there, or is this a lack of imagination on Miyazaki's part to think that?
No, I don't. It's
I'll
not
put
like
women in these fantasy. Yeah, like is the masculine space deliberate? I guess is the question.
I suppose we have to assume.
Do we assume the best or the worst? Yeah.
It is in this case, and therefore it's sort of different to these feisty young
that's what
female
it is,
heroines in the more discernibly fantastical stories. Because I suppose we might say something similar about Porco Rosso.
Sure.
You know, So.
Okay. We'll squeeze that lemon, I think, as far as it
No,
can go.
I don't really. I think it goes back to your original point about the masculine space of the film, and therefore our attention is drawn to the moments with female characters and trying to figure out how they're working within this. Because when tuberculosis rears its head, I was like, oh, okay, we're into Toro territory now. We're in. There's always something. There's always an ailment or an illness or something. But anyway, I don't know. There's something quite interesting about the film's use of masculine kind of space and connecting that to the world of aviation, that issues that kind of course corrects some of the gendered narratives around flight and empowerment and seeing the world in a different way and all that sort of stuff that is often associated with Ghibli. It feels very different. It's kind of almost taking the theme of flight and then going, well, this is a different way of doing it, or it's a different. Yes. This is what would happen if a group of. This is what would happen if I made stories about flight, but about men, because this is what they'd want to do. Yeah. They'd want to conquer the world, and
it will end up in war.
Yes.
It will end up. That's what I think. Yeah.
But as long as they get to make their planes, I get. Yeah. Okay. So to add to that one, then we've got the gender question. I've also got an issue or a query about the kind of the role of cosmopolitanism in the movie, in that we have this kind of central. Sorry, I just took a second to look at Chris's face.
Yeah, I'm just interested.
Right, where's he going with this? Yeah. There we got this. Basically, I was thinking about Miyazaki's kind of, infamous, famous kind of eclectic mix of Western and Japanese influences, and we get a lot of that. We've mentioned Rossetti. We've is it Paul
Valery?
Paul Valery, the quote
at the beginning. And then we've got this character who, wants to learn to speak French, moves to Germany, can kind of live in all these different amazing European cities, and back home it doesn't really matter because he's so cultured and au fait and all this sort of stuff. And that's kind of part of having access to this world, isn't it? Is that ability to kind of be cosmopolitan. And I couldn't help think of the kind of, is this a kind of surrogate Miyazaki, and this kind of part of Miyazaki's success as this kind of global figure is his ability to kind of make something uniquely Japanese that also it has all these kind of, Alice in Wonderland references and references to kind of, adaptations of various kind of, there's a cosmopolitanism in his success as a global icon that is reflected in this character, and there's that cosmopolitan, hey, that's great, we're all part of an international culture now, but then also an international culture where we all kind of drink coffees in lovely coffee houses and basically live the same life. This kind of there's that ambivalence. So back to the kind of key word of the podcast.
Yeah. But then you also hold on to what is apparently Japanese about it, the particular sensibility as regards nature, a particular valuation of beauty, and particular relationships between people. And so there is also, that's in a sense very much of our moment as something like the meme that goes, here's a thing, here's a thing, here's a Japanese thing, that there's something wanted there that's specific, but it also travels, I guess, and that has been the success of Ghibli and Miyazaki, I meant to check and didn't, but there was the deal with Disney for distributor, but this one is not. It was Studio Canal, and I didn't know if that was to do with the subject matter, or I remember at the time it came out there was a lot of criticism of how much people smoke.
Yes, talk about Japanese tobacco and stuff like that.
Yeah, that whole, and is it for children? I mean, Miyazaki was he wasn't sure if he wanted to turn the manga into a film because he didn't know if children should or would watch it, and someone persuaded him that children shouldn't be protected from horrible things, and so the story goes. So he went for it, but that's sort of moving it into another place. But it's there's also the part. It's cosmopolitan, but it also has the beauty and the ugliness of Japan at that time. It's not shielded from its fascism, its alliance with Hitler Germany, and all of those things.
It's the reflexivity, I think, of one of the characters. So his best friend that kind of constantly talks. It seems like he talks down to Japan. I can't believe this is like this. I can't believe this is what our economy is like now. They make some allusion to it being kind of backwards and stuff, and even the modernity of. I think he's the one who says that even the new buildings are old-fashioned. That almost Japan is caught. It's not modern in the same way that other places are modern in the world. It's kind of restrained in that sense. So it absolutely makes sense that these are the characters that would wish to try and that they are most acutely connected to. Like technology, and because they are trying to. There's almost a fatalism in using war and weaponry to articulate a masculine desire to want to shed this world of tradition that is associated perhaps in gender terms and move Japan forward. But the risk here is that it's being moved forward through. It's not just flight; it's flight and guns, and it's that trajectory, I think. But I don't know.
Okay.
But it's a kind of curious. It's a really curious film, actually. The more I think about it, and I'm sort of I don't know what to make of it really.
We should, I guess, start wrapping up because that flew by, pun intended. Oh my God. Anyway, as I get over that, can
I talk about clouds?
I'd love you to talk about clouds.
So. Yes, we talked just before we started about your work on cloud animation, which is an article for Animation Interdisciplinary Journal. So this is a very awful question, but do you think in this, because I was struck obviously by the fact that there's a cloud on the front cover of your art, does wind work in some of the stuff that you send around kind of cloud animation and the quality of technology and the fact that we also live, I think in your article you talk about the cloud. Is there something to be said about the way wind works? Because a lot of animation technological advancement is connected to the elements. For a long time it's sort of fire and water, and you can take your Shrek and you're Finding Nemo and so I wondered whether some of the conclusions that you draw around cloud animation are in any ways connected to the role of wind in the film. I just wondered as I was watching it. If any of your conclusions around that kind of elemental quality to Miyazaki. He's talking about nature, but he's talking about it. Wind does something to nature. It unsteadies it. It's like the earthquake. The earthquake does what the wind does, but in different degrees. And so I'm just interested in this kind of animation being used to render the elements, but doing so in a way that is obviously visually really striking, and the way that a lot of the design in the film works. Clouds, wind.
Off you go.
Off you go. Yeah, I'd love to. I just wanted to ask.
I suppose. I mean, there's that utopian kind of view of clouds. So I think is it in Kiki's Delivery Service? I think it is, where she's sort of lying on the grass and cloud gazing.
Yes.
Clouds sort of move by very gently, and it's the whole Thoreauian thing. We must sort of take time in every day to slow down and connect to these entities. But in this film, I mean, there are extraordinary cloudscapes in this film, and sometimes it's like not single clouds in a blue sky, but whole areas of these sort of glowing yellow clouds, sometimes slightly ominous. It's a much more blanketed field of clouds, which, of course, are the entities through which these planes will fly and which they will use as cover. I mean, they go up to Nagoya, is where they're doing work on the Mitsubishi, which I got interested in previously because I was looking at a Japanese scientist who made the first artificial snowflake quite difficultly, but he was working up at Nagoya, where I think there's quite a lot of fog, and they were sort of trying to produce artificial fogs and to examine the effect of fogs on fighter plane, on the Mitsubishi engines. And so all of that sort of work around weather in that place was tied into military effort. So, we could think about Peter Sloterdijk and the explication of air and chemical warfare and the production of these toxic gases that muzz up the battlefield. So, is the cloud here suggesting that it's on the point of becoming sort of militarized, or even the sky with its cloud cover and its cloud action is going to interact with this human pursuit of war. But, the clouds are also still these beautiful little entities. They're blown around. We're blown around as well, similarly. So we also see ourselves in those clouds. So, I think it does take clouds both to same places and other places.
I think from an artistic perspective, obviously, weather is something that I'm sort of fascinated when there are scenes of rain. You're sort of it's kind of these are sort of tour de force sequences of. But maybe what you said about the militarization of nature is ultimately the thing that makes this film actually the most typical of Miyazaki, because that's sort of seems to be the natural culmination of all of these messages that have been bubbling along over the last however many kind of 20 years. That we are now at the point where there is this militarization of nature, and it's becoming quite encompassing. So I don't know. That seemed quite I think there's a real sense in which animation uses nature. Ghibli in particular uses nature and the elements to sort of showcase quite complex scenes and sequences, but this is obviously taking something that is usually the space in which you have these young female characters taking to the skies to a set. This is now transforming it, as you say, and militarizing that space, which, as I said, makes it seem like actually perhaps the most on-the-nose Miyazaki of them all then.
Yeah, interesting.
But is that where the film is going? Well, even that place is not safe anymore. Because this kind of wielding of, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was this space of fantasy in these films.
Now it's a space of warfare and destruction.
And the earth can erupt in an earthquake, and from the sky, sometimes the sort of the squadrons of planes looked like birds, flocks of birds. So they're sort of naturalizing. So up there, death can rain down. From there, it can come up from underneath. It's like every layer. There's danger. There's peril. Potentially.
So I like that as a sort of hark back to the opening. And the sort of shot of glasses, and that he can't be a pilot because he's short-sighted. It's almost, as you said, there are certain scenes where you think, it's a flock of birds. Oh no, hang on, it's some. So there's almost unfortunately now, what seems like the natural, if you look a bit closer, is being. Yeah. There's something. So maybe it is the most fatal, as I said, a most kind of on the nose Miyazaki in that sense.
Yeah, and the consequences of that is like there's something about the way we would have seen the world. Is gone now, an innocence or I think is that is it a bird, is it a plane kind of problem, it was just birds once and now we don't know anymore because they bloody embedded them.
That's ambivalence, isn't it? We don't know anymore.
Anyway. Right, is there any other things I'll let you cough.
Sorry.
No, you're welcome. Are there any other key things that we haven't covered that you wanted to talk about, Esther? Is there any key tidbits or bits that you wanted to chat about before we wrap up?
I don't think so.
You're good?
Good? I guess the only thing is something that you mentioned at the start about kind of when you went to see Spirited Away and sort of seeing these Ghibli films and trying to make sense of them, or are these for children, are these for adults, all that. It is The Wind Rises. Does it feel like it's part of that? Is there kind of a thing with Studio Ghibli that makes these kinds of films kind of curious because of some of their ambivalence or their use of fantasy and stuff? And it's not just their Japaneseness, but I think we've always tried, I've mentioned this at the start, figuring out a way to do Ghibli in a slightly different way that isn't just reading out the IMDb trivia page about nature and stuff. And so I just wondered, in terms of some of the other films that you've seen and stuff, does this is it right that it feels really, really different in terms of some of the other Ghibli stuff that you've been interested in? Or does it actually feel quite typical? Because I started the podcast thinking one thing, and now I've ended thinking, actually, maybe it is sort of a culmination of lots of these kind of messages. But clearly Miyazaki's films are quite curious in lots of ways. So I'm just interested whether you think it's kind of typical or atypical in that sense.
I think it reflects back on a lot of things that have been in the other films, but it's of taking them in a different direction or reflecting on them differently, or I don't know, maybe it's taking all those base themes like flight and materiality and human development or not, and love, and trying to lay them out on a kind of canvas without any directing, without any trying to foreclose how we might understand them. Maybe he felt all his other films had been lent themselves to certain kinds of readings, or too simple a reading, or to say things that he didn't necessarily stand by or want them to be understood as, and so he wanted to, because it has to be provocative to all the things that are not said here, to go into this area and then not to really deal with the political implications of it in a very particular moment of Japanese political history, when all these things were being opened up again and there was a remilitarization of the Japanese Air Force, or there were all sorts of arguments going on, and to sort of just lay it out has to be a deliberate decision. So in that regard, I don't know about typical or atypical. I see it as continuous but different.
Yeah. To me, it's a sort of you could see Miyazaki kind of having the kind of potential criticism from some of those, what will be like, it's all very well you making these grand statements about the kind of the relationship between nature and technology, these kind of themes that we know well, but you make films about fantasy worlds, so like, that's easy to say in a film like Spirited Away, because you get to decide the rules of the world you've created, but we live in a real world. How can you make that point? And almost this film is the kind of response to that, which is that I make those kind of movies, I'm interested in those kind of things because of the world that I want to look away from, almost. This is because this is also, it's a precursor thing, isn't it, to things like, I think Totoro is all meant to be in this kind of 1950s sort of kind of era, and this is almost like a pre-story to his emergence into the world. So he's talking about the world into which he's born, what went before him, and how, what was the legacy of that? Does that explain something about him and what was to come and what he would make all the way through the 60s, 70s? And
yeah, that's really interesting that this is the film that this is the film that creates the conditions by which the other Miyazaki, this is what the Miyazaki's earlier films were responding to.
Yeah.
This heightened moment where fantasy and history were weaved in and out. And so the film plays with that and then says that, okay, Miyazaki's ultimate response to this would be Totoro and Spirited Away and stuff like that.
Ursula Guin writes there's a really great line. So why do we write stories about dragons? And it's kind of a similar response because the world is as it is.
So this is him going back to, I hadn't really thought of that, because you're right that Totoro's 1950s. So this is him going back to the sort of this is him setting the context for his entire filmmaking. Like, this is how he was going to navigate. This was his response, or this was his catharsis, or his kind of work using animation to kind of play through these themes. I'd not thought of that.
Yeah. Well, or it isn't. One of the two. I'm still reckoning with the movie, but I think I've reckoned a bit. I'm reckoning a bit closer to where I might be on it now. But It's a really rich movie full of interesting themes, it takes me about 3 goes with any Ghibli movie, and I think this one might need even more so. But but thanks for
thank you very much,
and thank you for coming on to chat to us about it. I mean, is this any of these thoughts? Is this going to be any kind of outlet in the next year or so, or is these are just for listeners only?
Just for listeners.
There you go.
Beautiful. In which case, if you're interested in and want to hear more about Esther's kind of wider kind of work and things like that, and you haven't had the pleasure, Chris will make sure to put a full list of a full list of books in the show notes.
Well, there is no excuse for any animation scholar worth their salt to not have a copy. In fact, I think I bought 2 copies of Hollywood Flatlands by accident. I gave you one.
Yes, that is true. I do have
absolutely true. Because I bought it and was like, I've got to own this book, and I already owned it. Anyway, so yes, we'll put a whole list of, and it's interesting because some of the stuff and some of the names that you've mentioned and it absolutely, in some ways, goes back to my very first question. How does this film? It feels a bit left field, but maybe it's not left field in terms of your research interest. So, But I like the fact this is the podcast. This is where listeners can hear and stuff like this. So thank you very much.
Thanks for going on.
Thank you.
You can, of course, follow us on all kinds of social media. You might be on or might not be on when you're listening to, but we're on some of them.
Yes. And not on others.
And not on others. At Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. You can find us at fantasy-animation.org, where you can find the archive of blogs and podcasts. There's plenty more about Ghibli.
Yes, there is.
On both formats, so check them out if you haven't listened to them already.
Yep.
Give us a like, all that kind of stuff, please. It always helps. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Bye.